Welcome to our very final unit in the course, Unit 2, Crisis in Science Education, which is contained within Module 6, our Global Science Education concluding unit. So we have actually completed 18 units in total across this course. So hopefully you feel you've got a really comprehensive grasp of lots of these concepts that we've introduced. Now, in our preceding unit, Unit 1, we gave a real snapshot of an overall global picture of how science and science education in particular can have an impact on students becoming global citizens and where science fits within that sort of picture. Now, this final unit, the other Unit 1 was a little bit more positive in that we wanted to see positive change and ways we can influence. This unit tends to be a little more pessimistic in that it presents a picture of science education in Australia at the moment. And a lot of science educators are calling this a crisis in science education for all of the reasons that I'm going to outline in this particular mini unit. So we want to have a bit of a look, but we want to end on a positive note with what we can do to try and improve the situation and then see where science education in Australia might fit within that overall global picture. So just an overview of the course, because we are in our last unit. So basically there's a paper attached to this unit, the Russell Tytler, his 2007 paper. Now I've included that link in Learning at Griffith. Now I have included the link to the entire paper, which is quite lengthy. There are specific sort of pages that are more relevant to you. I think it's chapters 1 through 3. You'll just have to check that. But basically, this was the impetus for this course, this paper. So when I read this paper back in 2007, I thought, well, we really need to think about some of these issues and ways we might want to try and solve them. And one of the most important ways to do that is to educate our future teachers, people like you, who will be in the classroom teaching our students. So basically, the impetus for the whole course was to try and address some of the concerns that are in that paper. So in this course, you've developed knowledge and understanding of the personal, social, environmental, cultural, and historical significance and relevance of science. So we know that today's science students need to be able to make informed, evidence-based decisions about current and future applications of science. Our students also need to recognise that science has advanced through and is open to the contributions of many people from different cultures at different times in history, and that science offers rewarding career paths. And hopefully through the 6 modules that we've completed, you've been able to see snapshots of all of those aspects in that dot point. So the following slides provide a summary of the Tytler paper, in addition to some other relevant information that I've put in there just to supplement it. Please complete this final unit, and at the end of the unit I'll be asking you to do a final concept map to add to your initial one you would have done in the course introduction module to enable you to finish your portfolio. So you really need those maps because one is the before and the other is the after to be able to reflect on your learning. So what is this so-called crisis in science education? And it's not just restricted to Australia. Many other developed countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, lots of developed countries have a similar problem because we have less students taking sciences in years 11 and 12. So that's what that means, is diminishing proportion of students in the post-compulsory, as in year 11 and 12, who are undertaking science subjects, and particularly the physical sciences, which are physics and chemistry. So why is this a problem? Well, we know our societies are in increasing need of science and technology-based professionals. You've probably seen the acronym STEM, S-T-E-M. That's the new catch-call for basically it envelops all of these types of students. And basically what the governments particularly are pushing is that we need more STEM professionals to be educated in our schools to sort of flow on through that pipeline into tertiary education and then into the workforce. So it is driven by an economic agenda. Pretty much governments want to stay on top of making sure that they have the most educated workforce that they possibly can that fits industry needs. But, for us, the concern's not really at all economic as educators. Our concern is that we really want our students to be scientifically literate and well disposed towards science. So here you can see that STEM acronym here, projected percentage increases in STEM jobs. So basically this is US figures, but you can see that there's a 14% projected percentage increase in jobs overall, but within the specific disciplines of STEM, you can see the demand is looking to be increasing. So there's some knock-on effects of this. So we know that the shortage of skilled science professionals in the workplace in Australia has been documented. We also know there's a shift in momentum of science-based development to developing countries. What that means is we outsource a lot of our industry needs now to places like China and a lot of places in the Pacific now. You may have noticed that or encountered that yourself. There's considerable evidence of student disenchantment with school science in the middle, or what we now call junior secondary years. So we know this is where we lose our students. It's around that year 9, 10, where they're making those major decisions about their futures, where we lose them, and where science becomes dull and recipe style in their labs and things like that. So they lose that creative element. There's also quite a significant concern with the current shortage of qualified teachers of science, and also a looming shortage, as in the future it's forecast that we're not going to have enough science teachers. So let's have a look at what we call traditional school science, and pretty much this view of science is one that we're hanging on to pretty tightly in schools. We're trying to integrate more of a scientific literacy approach, but it's very hard to change schools. They have their own little political agendas all on their own. So pretty much the broad shape of science education has remained relatively unchanged for the last half century, and this has been pretty similar across other developed countries as well. So the main emphasis is on the development of conceptual knowledge, and it's in the distinct disciplines. So we have our chemistry, we have our physics, our biology. So we have those distinct disciplinary strands. There's an emphasis on the use of key abstract concepts to interpret and explain relatively standard problems. So what that means is that sort of textbook science of here's photosynthesis, here's osmosis, here's diffusion, but not really linking those concepts together in any meaningful way. The treatment of context as mainly subsidiary to concepts. What that means is we're more interested in the actual concept itself, like forces and energy and those broad concepts, instead of understanding how they operate within a context. So say within the efficiency of an engine or how a roller coaster works. So Queensland schools are quite good in year 11 and 12 in that they do have a little bit more of a context-based curriculum, but we are shifting towards the Australian curriculum for year 11 and 12. As well as what we have now for years prep to 10. So when that happens, any sort of context-based syllabus learning that we have had is going to be somewhat watered down. And we always have had this emphasis on practical work to illustrate principles and practices. So it's used more as a verification. So traditionally we teach the content and then we go into the lab and we verify it, we illustrate what we've just taught, instead of using the lab as perhaps a starting point for students to investigate their own problems and form their own knowledge. So these are pretty consistent figures of science education in most schools throughout the developed world. But we do know science has changed, society has changed. So it's changed in a number of ways. And I'm going to run through some of these here. So the changing practice of science. We know that scientific research and technological development have changed substantially over the last 50 years. They're hardly recognisable now to what they were 50 years ago. This idea that we have the solo scientist in the white coat, just in his lab, always a male too, doing his private experiments and, developing new knowledge is gone. It just doesn't happen that way. We know it's practiced on a large scale, with significant funding, and with the funding very much driving what gets examined on teams that can be global, commercial, multidisciplinary, significantly technologically linked, and often having significant community implications. So it's a much bigger enterprise now. The changing nature of how we engage with science. Okay, so controversies involved in conflicting views between science experts or governments and scientific enterprise, like those that are happening right now with climate change, imply an increasingly important role for science education in preparing our future citizens to engage with these issues. So we need to know what's happening. We need to know what governments are trying to push. The challenges to science, this has come about more in the last half decade. The need to accommodate Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum. So we know the Australian curriculum science, F to 10 or Prep to 10, has a very strong agenda about ensuring Indigenous perspectives are included. So this again raises questions about the nature of science, and I've seen some of those on the discussion boards. Lots of really interesting comments there about the place of Indigenous science. The knowledge explosion. Now this is key. So when I went to school, there was no internet, showing my age, but now our students grow up with this internet access. They can access any knowledge they want to, if they want to access. So what is our role as educators? It's changed. It used to be that the teachers had to be the providers of knowledge and the textbooks had to provide it, but now our students can just Google things. I'm not saying that they're particularly accurate, but they have a much greater access to knowledge. Changes to the nature of schooling. So the role of the teacher, which I've just touched on, they're no longer the expert knower who delivers significant and stable concepts to dependent students. Okay, students have an ability to access knowledge all on their own. So that changes the nature of teaching and learning. Okay, so the need to focus more seriously on learning and the capacity to learn as a major aim of science education is our goal now, rather than continuing to accept knowledge acquisition as the single goal, because they can do that themselves. And our students have changed. So even back 25 years ago, when I was finishing school, the main goal of schooling, if you continued past year 10, and probably when I went to school in the late 80s, a large proportion of students actually exited school at the end of year 10. Whereas now we have government pushes to ensure students remain through to the end of year 12, and if they don't, they need to be involved in some kind of training or employed. So there are different priorities now. So the curriculum was set up quite differently because up until, midway through the 20th century, the proportion of the population who completed year 12 was very small. And the curriculum was structured around the goal of preparing this select group for an academic education. So you just weren't allowed to just go on to 11 and 12. Most of the time you had to go out and work because of financial reasons, and the curriculum was actually set up and streamed to become a very academic discipline, which only allowed the very so-called intelligent students to be successful. Now, we do know that the rapid expansion of secondary education over the last half of the previous century has meant that by the 1980s, there's a need to broaden the curriculum. So as more and more students were continuing on into year 11 and 12, there was a recognition that the current curriculum actually didn't provide for those students. So by broadening the curriculum or providing more choices with the types of subjects students could take, it enabled more students to successfully complete year 12. So the need to make science relevant to all students, including those not proceeding to post-compulsory education, has underpinned the current scientific literacy focus for school science. So we now know our goal is not just to produce little scientists. Okay, our goal now is we have a large proportion of students going through to year 12, the great majority of students. We need to now have a more functional aim for our students. And what we want them to do is exit school with some understanding of a lot of the principles we've covered in this course. And think about what your thoughts are on this focus. I mean, if you're a very academic student, you might think, well, I'd prefer to have a curriculum that sets me up just for, tertiary study. Or you might have a very different view if you were going to go into a trade or you wanted to go straight into the workforce. Think about how you conceptualize these changes. So what are these main elements of the crisis that we keep talking about? So we do know that students are developing increasingly negative attitudes to science over the secondary school years, which we touched on before. We do know we have less students participating in our Year 11 and 12 science subjects, particularly physics, chemistry and higher maths such as Maths B and Maths C. We know we have a shortage of science qualified people in the workforce, and we have a shortage of qualified science teachers. So let's have a look at these student attitudes. We just said that they are increasingly negative. So why? So the decline in interest in the middle years of schooling, or in those junior secondary years, anywhere from around about year 6 up to year 10, because that's the period of adolescence. Okay, and students developmentally have different demands and different requirements for their education. So we do know though that those middle years are critical, because it's in these years that attitudes to the pursuit of science subjects and careers are formed. So when they go from primary to secondary school, this transition has a number of implications. So what tends to happen, and you will all know this as primary teachers, is in the primary school context, we have a very personal relationship between the teacher and the student, or the teacher and the child. It's usually conceptualized in primary, in that it's not just the deliverer of knowledge. A teacher acts as an emotional, a social support to students, and is actually quite responsible for their development. So we do know that there's a personal element to the relationship between a teacher and a student in a primary setting. Now, when they move to high school, it's quite different because all of a sudden they may have a core teacher for, say, English, maths, science, but then they'll have a number of other teachers. So they have to actually change the nature of how they relate to people. So when they lose that personal interrelationship, it actually has an effect on them psychologically. It's quite a big transition for them to make. It's a big change from activity-based science to one dominated by transmissive approaches. So what tends to happen is science in primary school is usually a fun, enjoyable experience, lots of hands-on, lots of relatable concepts to everyday life. And then they go to year 7 and they go into the lab and learn the Bunsen burner and get their license and learn the names of all the equipment. It becomes a lot more transmissive in that the big picture can sometimes be missing. Curriculum that allows little flexibility for the tailoring to individual student needs. So our current Australian curriculum, the need to adapt that to the individual learner is sometimes problematic. And a number of studies have explicitly linked this decline in interest to the nature of the traditional science curriculum and its inability to make science meaningful and interesting to students. So let's have a look at some figures for participation. So we know there's a drop in the proportional numbers of students taking very much so physics and chemistry and the higher mathematics. So from 1992 to 2010, so Year 12 biology dropped from 35% of all students to 24%, so it dropped from a third to a quarter of all Year 12 students. Although 24 is still a quarter, so that in a way that can kind of be somewhat comforting. Year 12 went from a quarter to less than that, so 23 to 17%. And physics, 21 to 14%. As might be expected, reports on participation in university science courses indicate a flow-on effect from school enrolment trends in the 90s, which shows a sharp decline in enrolments in the natural and physical sciences. So obviously, as these numbers get smaller, it's less students going in to tertiary education in those areas. So while overall university enrolments more than doubled between 1989 and 2007, the actual number of students taking physics fell by around 19% and chemistry by 5%. So while the number of students enrolling in biological sciences rose by 74%, this still constitutes a proportional decline. So there's lots of speculation, and the media has a view, and the Science Foundation has a view, and tertiary educations have a view about why we have this decline in science subject enrolments. So a big study conducted by Terry Lyons back in 2010 suggests the main factor is actually having more choice. So I remember when I went to school, our subject choices were a lot more limited than when my children entered year 11 and 12. So there's a lot more to choose from. So it's not even so much that people don't like science, it's just maybe it's not as popular as other choices. So the result has been the decline not only of science subjects, but also in other traditional subjects such as economics, accounting, geography, political, social sciences. So it's not unique to science. Look, you can take lots of fun things now. Like my son took hospitality. He thought it was great. He loved it. He did well in it, and he actually still works part-time in hospitality as he's pursuing his university studies. So, there's lots of reasons why students take different subjects. So here we go. So subjects such as business studies, hospitality, computer studies, food and catering, music, performing arts, creative and visual arts have seen substantial increases. So now let's look at who is teaching science. So this could be you. If you end up teaching junior science in a high school, or if you teach in a P12 school, you might teach up into sort of year 7 or 8. So we do know in Australia there's a current problem and a looming crisis in the supply of secondary science teachers, particularly for year 11 and 12 in physics and chemistry. And we do know that this is a trend that's seen not only here but also overseas. So we know we've had difficulties recruiting science teachers. We do know there's a notable number of vacancies for physics and chemistry teachers. I actually teach in the secondary science program here at Griffith, and towards the end of around October each year I get phone calls from principals of schools that I know who are basically looking for physics and chemistry teachers even before they graduate. So senior secondary school teachers appear on the skills shortage list in Australia, and the percentage of schools that report difficulties in adequately staffing physics and chemistry is 40% and 33% respectively. The other factor too is there are high levels of disillusionment. So what that means is that teachers aren't happy. So okay, let's cut through the fact that we don't have enough of them, but when we do have a teacher that is employed in a school as a science teacher, what we're finding though is the teachers aren't happy in those positions. So they're not happy with their work conditions and they're not happy with students' attitudes. So they're two of the factors that seem to be key. There's also low levels of expectation of staying in teaching in the longer term. And this is a really significant issue, and it's one I'm hesitant to bring up because I think, as a pre-service teacher about to enter the profession, it's so important to be positive and not always look at negatives, because there are many more positives to teaching than there are negatives. But we do know that the attrition rate, so the rate of people leaving the profession, is very high in teaching. So I think the figures are something like after 5 years, only 50% of people that qualified with a teaching degree are actually still working in the school sector, which is a little scary, but there are reasons for that. And sometimes people find that they're not as well suited to the profession, or they have opportunities elsewhere. There's lots of reasons. So they're the issues. It's all a bit depressing, isn't it? I don't want to end on such a low point, but I think it's very important to be aware of the context that you're entering, and like any profession, there are pros and cons. So that's been a whole lot of big cons for you, but let's think about ways we can solve them. Scientific literacy is a great way to do it. So scientific literacy is now the key goal of science education in many countries. So the outcome of scientific literacy is we want our students to progress towards becoming scientifically literate individuals. Okay, so what that means is scientific literacy refers to an individual's scientific knowledge, so what they develop, their concepts, and how they use those concepts to identify questions in science, to acquire new knowledge, to explain scientific phenomena, and to draw evidence-based conclusions. So we want them to be able to use their science to make decisions about science-related issues. And we've talked a lot about that in this course. We want them to understand the characteristic features of science as a form of human knowledge and inquiry. So that relates to our nature of science. We want them to understand science is not just something that's out there, that's inaccessible unless they have certain skills. It's actually a human construction that everyone can be a part of. An awareness of how science and technology shape our material, intellectual and cultural environments. So those links, science and society, science and technology. Willingness to engage in science-related issues and with the ideas of science as a reflective citizen. So everything we did with science and ethics and science and decision-making and bringing into consideration all those types of factors when we're trying to solve a scientific issue. So here's the characteristics that we'd like our students to have when they leave school. We want them to be interested in and understand the world around them. We want them to engage in the discourses of and about science, so we want them to be able to engage in scientific discussions. We want them to have some working knowledge of why these issues are important, some basic understanding of the issue and ways to go about resolving things. We want them to be able to identify questions, investigate and draw evidence-based conclusions. We want them to be skeptical. Now, we've talked a lot about questioning things in this course. Questioning claims. It doesn't mean that science is useless, but it does mean we don't take things at face value. We look at both sides, and we've done a lot of that in this course. Okay, we have to consider that there's other perspectives and we need to weigh them carefully and look at how the evidence is being used to support different opinions. We want them to make informed decisions about the environment and their own health and well-being. So that's ultimately what we want them to do as functioning citizens. We need them to know that when they go to the doctor and they hear information, that it's important perhaps to get another opinion. Okay, we want them to know that when they're making a decision about, I don't know, what laundry detergent to buy or whether their child should drink cow's milk, all those types of things, that they know that they can go and find information and weigh up the value of that information. And that was from a lovely lady called Leonie Rani, a science educator who's just recently retired. She was a very knowledgeable lady. So in everyday life, individuals will make many personal decisions requiring the application of scientific knowledge and skills. Some of these will be very personal, for example, relating to a health issue. Remember we talked about cancer and diet and, stem cells? While other decisions will contribute to global difficulties. So, any of those global issues like climate change, reducing hunger, water usage. Individuals often believe everything they hear in the popular media. The challenge is, how do we use our scientific knowledge to make reasoned judgments about these complex issues? So this is the majority of the population here. Probably you before you did this course. Maybe not, but maybe. Okay, we want to use our scientific knowledge to make better judgments. Good science education aims to provide individuals with the tools to be active decision makers of the future. So here it is in a nutshell. So to be scientific literate, means you understand the nature of science. All those things we covered in our first module, all right, about the creative, evidence-based, tentative, social and cultural nature of science. We want our students to understand that. They need to understand the way science interacts with society, how ethics are involved, how technology is involved, how we make decisions about issues in society. And thirdly, we want them to have an understanding of the more important and enduring science concepts. What that means is probably more the traditional school science. We still need to understand concepts. So I don't in any way want to diminish that. We need to understand these processes. We need to understand forces and energy and how energy moves through the food web, the properties of matter and how matter interacts. We need to understand that, but we need to understand it also in the context of these things and not just on its own. So that is it. That's the end. So what I'm going to run through now are the last couple of things you need to do and your last portfolio item. So what I would like you to do now, just as you did in the introductory module, I'd like you to get a piece of paper, just an A4 sheet, write science as a human endeavour again in the middle, and then produce a concept map so you can go back to that introductory module if you're not sure how to do that. Brainstorm your understanding. So there are no wrong answers, but I can guarantee, and don't get out the initial one now and look at it, I guarantee, just doing it without your notes, just right now, there's no wrong answers, but you are going to be hopefully pleasantly surprised at the change in the development of your understandings. Once again, take a photo of your map, save it. I'd really like you to include those in portfolio item 7. It's not explicitly on there that you have to do that, but I think it shows a really nice little contrast. But most importantly, the activities there for you to reflect on how your ideas have developed, and you need to do that for that item. So here's portfolio item 7, our last item, the culminating item. I think I call it that. I do. I want you to critically reflect on how your understanding of science as a human endeavour has changed over the duration of the course. I want you to look at your first map you created and the final one, and hopefully they will help you to aid in your reflection. All right, other ways you can do it, you can look at how your ideas have changed with regard to each of the topics in the modules as well, and I'll show you some examples of that when I show you the sample items. The second part is, so you have the critical reflection on how your understanding has changed. The second part, though, is I want you to think about the crisis in science education. So I want you to provide a rationale outlining how your developed understandings may help address some of the issues that we've just talked about. All right, so look at the paper, look at these slides. I want you to talk about how understandings of the module content can help facilitate change to all those crisis areas that Tytler talked about. So be sure to include specific references to issues outlined in the Tytler paper. As a guide, your reflection should be approximately 2 to 2.5 pages in length, but please, it is up to you. I'll show you 2 examples. The first is quite a good example, the second is not so good, and I'll give you some idea. Okay, so here's an example of reflection. The first thing I'm going to show you is, it's about that 2 pages. Didn't put a reference list, which is just something I want you to add. But basically talks about, didn't have a lot of idea, but the reflection is good in that she actually, or he, refers to the actual content of what is done in the modules. So she's talking about the nature of science, how that helped her change in this way, science and ethics helped her change in this way, science and decision making. So she actually goes sort of module by module, which is really quite a good way to structure it, how her understanding has changed with regard to each of those topic areas. You don't have to do it that way, but it certainly helps. I would tend to have subheadings too, like critical reflection and then the Tytler part, because now she goes on to talk about the crisis. She's referencing in text. You don't have to do that. But I mean, I guess it's kind of logical in that you are referencing a particular paper. You don't have to reference other things here. I want you to really just think about what was in the Tytler paper and link that to the course. So there's no need for extra references at all. And she then goes through and says how some of the problems, so from this I have an understanding that she understands the problems that Tytler identified and then how she would propose changing those. So that one was really quite good. Okay, this one, a bit more limited. For a start, you can see it's very short. Okay, it's a page with lots of spacing. There's no structure. The reflection, not a critical reflection, basically saying I thought I was good at it, but I've learnt new things. My ideas have changed, but not really being specific about how. So not linking into the module topics or the actual activities throughout the course. Very general and generic. So this is all about, it was good. I looked at different issues, debates and different opinions. The Tytler one is about two paragraphs. So this one's very underdeveloped. 1 or 2 references to Tytler, but not really giving me any specific ideas about how she would promote change, and no reference list. So not as good. And finally, our task sheet. Just a reminder too, it's due on Friday the 7th of April, end of week 6. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So here it is here, culminating item. It's marked out a 7.5. So we went through what's required, but let's have a look on our sheet. So portfolio item 7, highly accurate, informed and insightful understandings of not only science as a human endeavour, but also the crisis in science education aspects. All right, so I want to know you understand what we covered in the modules, plus that you understand the crisis in science education. And there are 2, 7A and 7B, so they're 2.5 marks each here. So I want a critical reflection on your self-learning, including explicit referencing. What I mean by that is I want you to reference the actual course materials when you're talking. So if you're critically reflecting, you're going, so in Module 3, Science and Ethics, that's what I mean by explicit, okay? So in Module 5, when we looked at science and technological advances and talk about specific things within that reflection, if you understand what I mean. This one here, critical reflection on many aspects of the crisis in science education. So make sure you're really across the different aspects that comprise that. And explicit referencing meaning either in text, title of 2007, or ensure and or. So definitely include a reference list at the end and put the full reference in there. So that's it. You've now completed all of the modules for Science as a Human Endeavour. Big congratulations to you. I know it's quite a bit of work, but being online, I wanted to make sure you had access to absolutely everything that you needed. I do think sometimes that you're kind of thrown in the deep end and you don't really have the materials. You know, content is useful if it's used in the right way. So you need both. You need content and you need meaningful experiences. So I've tried to put both of those together in this course. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed the course. It is my pet course. I love it, and I think it's so important for students. I hope you have some meaningful learning experiences you can take away, and I'm really looking forward to receiving your assessment to see how well you've learnt. So congratulations to all of you.